Good afternoon and welcome to today's office hours. I am so pleased to be joined today and be talking about the innovative approaches to communicate with individuals with dementia. Office hours are designed to be interactive. While we have a short presentation, we want to hear your questions, not only for our speaker, Heather Comstock, but also for each other who are on this call. Next slide, please. So just some basics, please stay muted. This session is being recorded and will be put on the NADTC website. Closed captioning is available, and I also put the stream text link in the chat if you prefer it that way. You may raise your hand when we get to discussion, or physically raise your hand if you are on video. This is designed to be interactive. Next. So just briefly, the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center is operated jointly between US Aging, formerly N4A, if you were familiar with that, US Aging and Easter Seals through a cooperative agreement with the Federal Transit Administration. Our mission is to promote the availability and accessibility of transportation options that serve the needs of older adults, people with disabilities, caregivers, and their communities. We provide technical assistance by phone and email. We have a lot of resources on our newly designed website. We also provide training in terms of resources, toolkits, webinars such as this, various communication and outreach, including our monthly e-news and e-alerts, and work a lot with coordination and partnerships across the country. We also provide investments in community solutions, which include our community grants, which we will be awarding the latest grants here in the next couple months. Next, please. So I'm very pleased to have Heather Comstock with us today. She is with the Family Caregiver Services Dementia Care Network in Wyoming, and a member of the Hub on Smith, which is a senior center there. Carol Wright Kenderdine, who is the co-director of the NADTC, connected me with Heather after she heard her speak. And I tell you, just talking with Heather about this presentation today, I was so excited to bring this to the network and have this as setting off of this office hours communication. So Heather's contact information is here. If you want to write that down, we can provide that to you at a later time. But at this point, Heather, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I would just first like to say again, my name is Heather Comstock. I live here in Sheridan, Wyoming, a smaller community on the edge of just about 20 minutes away from Montana, if you're kind of trying to figure out where that is in Wyoming. As our subject today is innovative approaches to communicating with individuals living with dementia, I do work with the Hub, and the Dementia Friendly Wyoming is a department of the Hub, and I always like to mention our generous funders, Wyoming Department of Health. They help us make it possible for us to offer a lot of our education to the communities here. So I want to briefly go over our objectives. We're going to discuss the impacts of distorted sensory experiences. We're going to identify some tools to harness the skills of assessing and securing the proper use of context, information, and conversational pacing and communication. And we're going to explore, most importantly, the lived experience of dementia. So let's get started. One other thing, if you're interested in additional education, we have a website, Dementia Friendly Wyoming. The website is actually DFW. Well, basically type in Dementia Friendly Wyoming, you'll find it. And we have a special section with Zoom workshops that are designed and given monthly. So feel free to join us, it's free, so happy to have you. So let's jump into what is the lived experience of dementia. And I think a lot of us have some ideas of what this is. But what I'd like to start off with is a look at it from a different point of view. I'd like to look at it from, first off, one of my favorite mentors. And his famous quote is, dementia is a shift in the way a person experiences the world around them. And I'm sure someone in this audience knows exactly who said this. It comes from Dr. Alan Power. And I appreciate his look at this because I think it really does help us start to have the conversation in our mind in a different way. One thing I think a lot of us experience and notice as practitioners, and also possibly as family of loved ones living with this condition, is there's a fluctuating awareness for the individual, as well as ourselves, about where that person might be in their journey. So they might be aware in that moment of what's happening internally and externally. They might also pop into a place where they're somewhat aware, maybe not as aware, maybe even a little bit foggy on what's happening. Sometimes they're unaware of what's happening, but honestly, so are we in our lived experience once in a while. And then they can even be aware and coping. Some people call this aware and covering, but I like to think of it as coping. So I like to think about this a lot when we talk about this subject. It's very easy for us to think a person knows more, or maybe they're manipulating us. But the truth of the matter is there's another layer, fluctuating ability. And this affects people living with this condition as much as it affects you and I. It could be their environment, could be too stimulating, not stimulating enough. It could be how we're communicating with others, which is what we're going to talk about today. Do they feel like they're being heard and listened to? Do they feel like they can express themselves? Are they getting enough rest? Who among us functions really well under not enough rest? And the research shows us time and time again, people living with dementia may not be getting adequate or proper amounts of rest. And then fluctuating ability can be so influenced by, are we eating enough? Do we have enough to drink? Are we hydrated? Those types of things. So when we think about this distorted sensory experience, I want to share a video, and I'm so excited to share this. If you've seen this, wonderful, and if you haven't, it's by a person who is living with this condition, dementia, and she gathered a bunch of her peers because they were having a different experience that their doctors didn't really understand. And so they created a video to help us understand what this was like from their point of view. Please listen for, there is an accent, and she's going to use the word lifts, and she means elevator when she uses that.
It's hard for me to remember what it's like to see normal and not have this in my life. It's your brain's ability to process and understand the picture that it's receiving. Design's very important. Colour is extremely important. So going into lifts is not my ideal situation because they do tend to put black mats. So when I walk into the lift, it looks as if there's no bottom to it. It didn't matter what type of dementia you had. People were talking about hallucinations. And my hallucinations is people's faces, distorted, you know, and different colours. And this can be really traumatic to me. So I have to learn that don't trust your eyes. But that can be dangerous too. You know, there was an old saying many years when I was brought up, it's so loud I can't hear. And that is what is happening. Everything is so loud and so bold and so much that it's distorted. Food was awful because it was an automatic spit out. It's like taking bleach or something that's you know, repulsive or off. So there was no thinking in this, it was an automatic response. I spoke to my consultant about this because I started to lose weight. I wasn't feeding or eating for taste, I was eating what does my brain accept, which was a total dining difference. I have olfactory hallucinations, phantom smells. So it's normal, awful smells. It's never the nice smell of coffee. The other one that is very common is the smell of burning. The fireman said most people without dementia would remove themselves, but people with dementia try to go to solve the solution we've found. So they go hunting the burning smell because we feel it's something we've done. A lot of people with dementia would say to me that they found touch and hugging quite painful. It's not just touch, it's when you're in the shower. The water becomes painful to you. It's like jagging needles constantly hitting their body. It can be frightening, you know, but I have learned that it's nothing to be frightened of, and to see it as, well, you know, I think really it's just learning to live with this is the reality.
So this is a wonderful resource that's been put together for us. And I would just like to ask all of you, feel free to type into the chat, how many of you have heard this kind of information or were aware of it? I love to say, you know, dementia is so much more than memory, but how many of us have ever heard this information? So feel free to pour into the chat if you've seen this before, if you've known about it. I want to offer that this group is pretty interesting. They've also offered us this Dementia and Sensory Challenges PDF. And then it gets better. I get so excited about this subject. They also did a Talking Sense PDF. So again, it helps us understand the full spectrum of this experience, all the way from, you know, when people want to be touched because they want that pressure, that sensory experience, all the way to people that don't want that, and how that impacts our daily experience from a professional point of view. I think that knowing this kind of information really helps us understand the conversations we're having and the point of view the other might be having, and also just understanding the sensory burden that person is possibly really under at all times. So at this point, I'd really encourage, and I encourage myself for the most part, to never underestimate the power of, thank you so much. I can see things coming in the chat. Right. Okay. Right. Thank you. We never want to underestimate the power of our facial expression, of our tonality of voice, and of our body language. And I know how simple that sounds, but if someone is struggling with, say, hallucinations, they probably need us to be a safe person, a safe place to talk with or seek support from. So if you take nothing away from this presentation today, these three things are the hallmark, the pillars of how I really try to reorganize myself and adjust myself at any given moment for people. So let's talk about some tools and skills. I often think about how much we need to continue to observe and reflectively listen for what will become evident. And I always say that we will know what to do when we get the information. So I think of a stoplight. This is not my analogy. Many other people use this, but a stoplight. And so let's just work through how this might play out. We might be working with someone during a transportation situation in which they appear a little confused. And if we're not fully understanding what they need, they're going to start having a miscommunication, or our communication might feel really a little bit askew. And eventually, someone's going to get a little frustrated. I love this stoplight analogy. It helps us really understand if we're frustrated, the task may not be doable. We might need to slow down and go back to trying to understand where each other are coming from, but mostly us as a professional understanding where the other is coming from. So for a person going through this, living with this experience, confusion is they're trying to tell us maybe what they like. Then they're telling us with this communication as it gets a little more serious what they want. And at some point at the level of frustration, we are at the point where we're listening to what they're telling us they need. And so it's part of our journey to really say, okay, there's a couple memos. I need to step back and figure out maybe how to de-escalate this situation and move forward. But let's talk about one thing that's really interesting in reframing this situation. What if we start to think about dementia, the lived experience, as a disability? And I'm sure this makes sense to many of you. So we would never ask somebody in a wheelchair to take the stairs unless they're an Olympic athlete. So a person with disabilities will require a reasonable accommodation. We can agree on that. What happens if we consider mindful communication a cognitive ramp? Now, this might mean we might not know what to do, so we have to think about it. And then we might have an inspired idea. Let's talk about one of these pieces of technology that could be very helpful. And if we just reframe it a tiny bit, it shifts everything. Let's talk about the power of cognitive ramps through adequate amounts of context. Bear with me. We are meaning-making creatures. I can say this with all wisdom, the small wisdom I've accrued in my lifetime. So context as a conversational tool helps us discern missing information. An example would be, hi, my name is Heather. That's the context right there. So let's consider context like this hovering bubble in our conversations. If I'm a speaker, I'm speaking with you, I have context in my mind, but I also have to hold how you, the listener, might be holding the context. So I'm holding my context with your context. And so there's a little bit of an overlap. I'm assuming I know what you know or don't know. So context carries broad elements of meaning. It gives us information about why something is being said, why it is being said now, and why it is being said in a particular way. Very interesting way to think about context. It depends heavily on memory, which can be a real tricky situation, because if a person doesn't always know what happened, what was said, why they're in a location, who another person is, or why they are present, it can make it really tricky for us to know how things are happening now, how they fit into what has or could happen or could take place at other times. Now, I know this is heady stuff. What I'm trying to say here is context also depends on one's ability to process information and stay in the conversation. So that can be really tricky because context is changing all the time. Let me slow down a little second. If we're having a conversation about what happened yesterday as we're getting ready to go for an appointment, and then we start talking about a future appointment, that is 3 points of context in one conversation, possibly a long sentence. So in that way, context has changed 3 times in that conversation. And if I have serious memory challenges, I might not have picked all that up. Which brings us to our next point, which is it is important for us to remember we have to appropriately pace ourselves in conversation. And so if we notice someone is dropped off, they're not able to stay with us in a conversation, we might have to back it up and go back to context a little bit. Meaning we might have to say, okay, let's get ready for our appointment. And instead of saying, and don't forget your coat, and don't forget your whatever else, we might have to just start with, let's get ready for our appointment. We can see they're ready to do that. Oh, and how about we grab our coat? And we go with that process, not giving them too much information. So we've got this idea of adequate amounts of context, which I fully think we're going to talk more about. The recognition that when we're with someone who's experiencing a large sensory experience, possibly way more sensory exposure than we are having at that moment, it might be hard for them to pay close attention to what's happening. So we might have to really make sure they're with us in that conversation and pay attention to, do they understand what we're doing right now? If we're missing context, oftentimes it could be something as simple as, do you have your, and sometimes people are missing 1 out of 4 words. So they might be missing that noun. And that noun could be, do you have your coat? And if they're missing that, they're missing the context. If we go on to another sentence, they're already feeling a little confused and they might not be able to move forward with us in that conversation. Appropriate amounts of information. If we notice people are not able to stay with us in the conversation, giving them additional information may or may not be helpful. Again, it's figuring out where we might have lost them. And then that proper conversational pacing. We know over and over again that as people are progressing with this condition, they need a little bit more time to process. And sometimes if they're trying to do something, they can't talk at the same time. So if we're trying to get them to a vehicle, we might want to just concentrate on getting to the vehicle and hold conversation for once we've got that task done, if that's appropriate for the person. I want to just say that this is quite possibly kind of feels like a big concept, but we have lots of good help. There's a professor who's created 3 different videos, and we're happy to provide you with those links. They're wonderful videos that will help us understand these subjects in more depth, and will even splay wider out into the whole idea of how linguistics is a fantastic way to really understand how conversation may be working well, or where we could adjust ourselves to do a better job. I want to fully acknowledge that in conversation, we can feel pretty alone. And if we don't feel like we're communicating well, whether we're living with dementia or we're supporting someone with dementia, it can feel a lot like this piece of water. I mean, there's just a whole lot of sea and not a lot of land. I want to just talk about the power of perspective and why I get so excited about understanding communication. I believe it takes what can feel pretty lonely and overwhelming to a place where there's a lot of resources available, especially when we try on these techniques and when we start to fully experience that muscle memory of how to work with people and kind of suss out where they are. What I can tell you is that perspective, our understanding of communication and how we can support others, really does improve communication. And therefore, it improves the lived experience of whatever service we're offering and supporting with the public. Not to mention, it also actually helps us in our personal lives, which is just a great bonus. Now, I realize that was a tour de force, and I know I covered a lot of ground. But I really hope that you feel that we did at least touch on some of the impacts of sensory experiences that others might be having. And if you've had the flu lately or had a migraine, you can think about this from the perspective of even how you're experiencing not feeling well. And I hope that you do feel that we've touched on a couple of tools that will help us harness and access better uses of context, and maybe really thinking about how we want to chunk that information better. And obviously, I've talked quickly today, but also understanding the power of conversational pacing, and if need be, slowing down and backing up to catch people up. And I hope through this conversation that you feel as though we've talked a little bit about the lived experience from persons' points of view, other than just our point of view. It can be really hard for us to imagine the experience of another without this information. So at this point, it looks like Carrie's asking us to think of some questions, and feel free to turn on our camera and raise questions for chat and all of that.
Thank you, Heather. I'm going to stop the recording and start it up again, just so we have this in 2 pieces.
Do you want me to stop the share so we can see each other?